Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachelle Māēyawekēsekōkiw Besaw, and today I'll be presenting on my research entitled Indebted to Thieves. In the first half of my presentation, I will discuss the violent history of extractive anthropology and linguistics upon Indigenous groups, with a focus on my own Menominee community, and I'll briefly discuss the moral and ethical implications of these acts from an Indigenous worldview. The latter half of my presentation discusses what it means to be an Indigenous researcher who's navigating my academic journey while being cognizant of the marginal space I inhabit and the debts owed to my community through my research. Some of my guiding questions were, firstly, how do I, as a person who grew up away from my community, learn about my tribe and my past? Secondly, how do I use data taken from exploitive sources in my own research? And thirdly, what are the moral and ethical implications of the past exploitive research on my current research? Bit of background about myself. I grew up in inner city Phoenix, and I'm a descendant member of the Menominee Indian tribe of Wisconsin. I was also a student tour guide for the exhibit Every Picture Tells a Story, which ran from September 9th, 2002 to April 17, 2017 at the Phoenix Herd Museum. I was proud to be a part of the first group of student tour guides there because not only was it an experience that helped my expressive adolescent self, but it helped me to connect to part of my identity that was just otherwise unavailable. While my family had a short stint living in Wisconsin when I was very small, and only for about a year, there was no way I was otherwise able to have access to my cultural heritage and our material culture. Poor kids from inner city Phoenix don't get to see woodland art every day. Being at the herd allowed me to connect with my culture, which I otherwise wouldn't have been able to. An example of this can be seen in the bandolier bag to the right, which hung in the exhibit and drew my curiosity about my heritage from the first time I saw it. So, the idea of dying civilizations of Native Americans has entranced settlers since time immemorial. The romanticization of the noble savage, the white savior complex that rallies so many to pity a group of quote-unquote doomed peoples and do nothing to actually help, but instead just take satisfaction in the idealization of doing so, and the collections that have arisen from them are as common today as they were 100 years ago. So this pervasive fantasy among Western scholars of quote-unquote saving Indigenous groups throughout the Americas has been focused not only on the collection of our mother tongues, our land, our material culture, but even the collection and hoarding of our bodies, and the rigidity with which institutions still hold onto these things as if they have a right to own what can never be possessed is an ongoing battle for many tribes. The collections of many individuals and groups may have stemmed from an interest in preserving history for future Americans or science, but unfortunately, that's just not always been the case. Perhaps one of the most notorious collectors, anthropologist Allen Skinner, is still referred today due to the unimaginable acts of unearthing sacred burial mounds on my own reservation, and bartering, stealing, and lying to get as many sacred objects as he could from the Menominee in a bid to fill museums' orders as quickly as possible. He would tell the Menominee individuals and communities that he was saving their sacred bundles and objects for the future, but had no actual intentions of saving them for descendants of those ancestors. Even Henry Ward, director of Milwaukee Public Museum, was quoted in a letter to his field agent as saying, "I would suggest the advisability of when you have skinned this reservation of moving on, and that if there's no immediate danger of anybody, namely Allen Skinner, coming into the region where you're at work, you can be more discriminating in what you require than if you feel that somebody is likely to jump your claim at any moment." It wasn't about the quality, it was definitely about quantity. Even the Smithsonian, arguably the most prominent museum in the U.S., published a circular in 1861 calling for the collections to increase and noting the difficulties and possible solutions as, quote, "the jealousy with which Indians guard the remains of their friends renders such collections in most cases a difficult task, but there are others in which these objects can be procured without impropriety." It also advised for objects to be taken from the graves of friendless slaves and, quote, "Indians killed on the battlefield, keeping in mind that, quote, numerous tribes had become extinct." As for the language, for Menominee, we see Māēyawekēsekōkiw, the Menominee language, as a living part of us. You cannot separate the language from life, as even its most basic tenets are based not upon gender or honorifics, but on animacy. So trees, rocks, and others are alive, and we navigate our relationship with the land around us by our relationships with these living and non-living things. Unfortunately, the federal government has run a very successful campaign of erasure and decimation against Indigenous languages of the Americas, and we've lost a great deal. Due to the policy under President Grant in 1867 to have each Indigenous group have a, quote, sameness of sentiment and thought via speaking and learning only English, linguists strove to, again, quote unquote, save these languages by documenting them. Most notably within my own community is Leonard Bloomfield, who came to the Menominee Reservation only during the summers of 1921 and 1922. Bloomfield's limited and misrepresented ideologies surrounding Menominee, specifically that of a man by the name of White Thunder, have become nearly totemic within linguistics, even though his own exposure within my community was quite limited. Even as recently as 2022, the Standing Rock Sioux tribal nation voted to ban the Lakota Language Consortium from their lands after a white linguist took what data the tribe believed was to be used for creating language materials for the community, and instead they copyrighted them for his own profits. This linguist took countless videos, recordings, and other documents from the tribe and attempted to sell back their own data to the Lakota speakers. Also noted is J.P. Harrington, a prolific collector of California indigenous languages whose work stemmed not from the need to preserve languages for the future use of its descendants, but instead so that he was the first person to document and squirrel away the data before his imagined competitors could do so first. So looking at the philosophy, it's commonly understood that ethics is considered individual conduct and morality is seen as a system of collective rules, norms, and codes. Unfortunately, within the social scientists, there are no formal definitions and no standardization across the disciplines. So how then can a system based upon the observation and study of people have no true definitions of ethics and morality if these are what's supposed to drive us all the time? I was bothered by the lack of standardization of ethics and morality, but more than that, as an Indigenous person who is constantly forced to read about history through the eyes of the academic conqueror, rather than the language and words of my ancestors, I was incised and distressed that at no point had the Academy sought to sanction the works of these scientists, nor question whether their actions were moral or ethical within history. As Fasten says, moral anthropology deals with how moral questions are posed and addressed, or symmetrically, how non-moral questions are rephrased as moral. Unfortunately, within the social sciences, ethics and morality are seen more as red tape and prohibitive to science, whereas IRBs are also seen as just a hurdle to get through instead of a good litmus test of ethical and moral conduct. So at the time of most of these collections, however unfortunate it may be, Indigenous peoples and communities were not afforded the full protection under the law as their Western counterparts when it came to human rights for legislation. Indeed, we did not even gain U.S. citizenship until 1924 with the passing of the Indian Citizenship Act. For most of these scientists, then, we were not seen as equal. One could argue that even in the face of acts such as the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, of 1990, and the Native American Languages Act, NALA, of 1991, we are still not granted the full protections under the law as other groups, for our legislation oftentimes lacked true teeth and force. The cold truth is that throughout the time of collections, we were just not seen as Americans. So what does it mean being seen as non-Western and non-Americans? Indigenous people were seen as outside the bounds of proprietary scientific collections methods that would otherwise be imposed upon Western acquisitions. We were not seen as equals. We were seen as people to manage versus individuals to collaborate with. This then led to the dehumanization, both historically and also in today. So it is cogitable that these individuals, these past scientists, simply didn't need to war within their own ethical or moral frameworks to find the wiggle room to see us as people. For these researchers, they didn't think they were doing anything wrong because they saw science as of the utmost importance and Indigenous individuals as a subject to be studied. To put it simply, we were not people. Our bodies and our cultures were simply an item to be collected and put on a shelf. We were the reason exhibits were opening and drawing crowds, getting people interested in science and making names for the researchers. There's something to be studied, not people to work with. So thinking uncritically may continue this trend. To put it simply, the issues within the anthropological and linguistic study of Indigenous communities, it's just deeply rooted in colonial understandings and ideas, and cannot be unentwined until that colonial mindset is fully addressed. I think it's important to talk about my positionality and my permanent marginality. According to Chapter 46 of the Menominee Tribal Code, I am qualified as a Menominee descendant. I'm a descendant member of my tribe. This is especially important with the recent rise of pretendians and descendiants within Indigenous studies across the United States and Canada and their outings. I do struggle internally with my own sense of belonging to a group. So as a person who occupies a space, it is important to address the question of belonging to a specific group, especially when dealing with the concept of whether one has a right to certain cultural information, and if our voices are representative of our nations and communities, or of that of academia alone. In order to criticize the theft my community has experienced, I believe it important to address the historical context of belonging legally to a community, as well as finding one's place within it personally. Phenotypically, I am accessible and or more palatable to outsiders, unfortunately. However, when it comes to working within my community, my phenotypic stance, the way I look, may inhibit my ability to connect with my community. And these are things that I have to struggle with as an academic and also as a Menominee woman. My work academically has been focused almost entirely on the work of linguists and anthropologists who have been extractive and harmful to both my own community as well as a larger Indigenous community of the Americas. I have based a good portion of my linguistic information on Leonard Bloomfield, whose work is quoted almost symmetrically with Māēyawekēsekōkiw, the Menominee language. Indeed, one could argue he made his career and name off of his building of our lexicon. But I've been asking myself, how does one reconcile the fact that in order to make one's name in the field, these older researchers are being credited once more? Current research always references past bad practices. Otherwise, your research isn't seen as legitimized. So having a critical eye towards what's known. Through my past and current research, I found that often what's written is just not always the truth. The facade of perfect academia came crumbling down, and I began to truly shake off the blind, obsequious faith in Western written word I learned in undergrad. I embraced a questioning attitude, and I listened to the stories of my people, not just what was written. I had to come back to the land and back to my community and stop only believing what was written in books. Unfortunately, that had been inaccessible to me as a child, but as an adult and a researcher, I was granted the opportunity to come back and live amongst my own people. Looking at a language ideology and artifacts, it needs to be questioned as well. Bloomfield was only here for 2 summers, and yet he says he understands it better than Menominees speak it, because many Menominees could not legitimize their way of speaking in his eyes, academically in a Western sense. For example, in his illiterate and literate speech, Bloomfield goes on to say that Menominees do not understand, the younger Menominees don't understand how to use obviation in storytelling. Obviation is a type of speaking that, culturally speaking, only older men use obviation in storytelling because that is what's culturally appropriate. Bloomfield didn't take the time to learn this because he's not a part of the community and didn't see it as relevant. Artifacts were also held for future use, and social sciences may see repatriation as anti-science. Physical artifacts and sacred goods have also been held hostage within institutions due to the worldview of Indigenous worldviews not being as important as Western views. Even with the introduction of NAGPRA, social scientists have used this legislation to argue that Indigenous groups are forcing religious views on science and impeding their work. This can be seen as recently as 2021 with, to the right, as Elizabeth Weiss, the curator of Indigenous skeletal remains at San Jose State University, her viral tweet about returning these goods. Often, the call for repatriation from Indigenous groups is seen more as a hysterical or emotional plea for these objects to be returned. Unfortunately, This was even quoted in the Havasupai versus the Arizona State case, where Havasupai were seen as being hysterical and overly emotional when requesting their items back from the state and from Arizona State University. Lastly, I'm going to talk about Indigenous agents and what it means to be an Indigenous agent, such as an Indigenous researcher within this space. Unfortunately, many of us that are Indigenous researchers focusing on anything to do with Indigenous items within social sciences are oftentimes seen as a pillar of the Indigenous community. It's not true. Just because you are a member of your community, you do not speak for the world of Indigenous people or of the Native community as a whole. However, outsiders may see you as a unique individual who then does speak as a pillar of their community. The truth is that I'm an Indigenous person who grew up away from my culture. So until recently, I found myself in what I like to call the cultural diaspora. So not only was I geographically displaced from my tribe, but I was also not allowed, due to assimilationist policies and intergenerational trauma, I was not allowed to learn and be a part of my own culture until very recently. However, one thing that anthropologists of the past did not account for was that descendants of their subjects reclaiming and taking over the field. These past researchers took our stories, our sacred ceremonies, our objects, and our bones, and promised that they would put them in safekeeping for the future, all while not really intending to do any such thing, which leads to reclamation. So I live and study in a precarious marginal space, one which indebts me to the practices of ruthless anthropologists and linguists of the past. However, because of their work, I am granted an opportunity to reclaim my heritage. So it's an interesting and sometimes very uncomfortable position to be in, knowing that I owe a debt to the extractive and exploitive researchers of the past, who I have shown to have dehumanized Indigenous peoples in order to be justified in their work, so that I may feel a connection to my heritage. However, it is possible to see good in this, such as some California tribes who were able to file for federal tribal status off of the work of J.P. Harrington's data in his collections. So while Harrington most likely never intended that to be the outcome, his work is allowing members of these tribes to not only claim a status to legitimize themselves in the eyes of the federal government, but also his tapes are allowing descendants of speakers to reclaim their languages and to also hear the voices of their ancestors they thought long lost, to learn stories, and to reconnect with those people. And lastly, the Western entitlement. So as a Western academic coming back to my community, I had to unlearn that just because it exists, I should have access to it. Not all things worth knowing are allowed to be learned by everyone. There is a time and a place to learn many things. As many Indigenous individuals know, you can't just ask a question and get a straight answer. You will learn things when you were meant to learn them. There is a season and a reason for all things. Sometimes you're not allowed to learn things due to your sex or gender or due to your biological conditions such as pregnancy or menstruation. And the Western ideals of knowing that, well, because that data exists and I ask the question, then I am allowed to know these things, or better yet, I am entitled to an answer, is simply not true within a lot of Indigenous communities. That's been one of the largest hurdles that I've had as an Indigenous researcher, and taking that step back and knowing that just because that data exists does not mean that I have a right to it. If I am going to be allowed into that space, I need to earn that right, and I need to be there at the right time in the right place, and then also decide what data to share with the outside world. So in conclusion, the dehumanization of Indigenous communities and peoples allowed researchers of the past to temporize their actions and to turn their non-moral and unethical acts into moral and ethical acts within their eyes because they dehumanize these groups. It's the responsibility to our ancestors to protect artifacts, languages, and to reclaim them. These are the responsibilities of Indigenous researchers within our spaces. And also, as researchers, we need to unlearn Western ideologies towards the past and to truly protect it from the future. Thank you so much for your time today and in joining us. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and I will get back to you via email as soon as possible. Moewanan, and have a great day.